Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're sitting down to discuss The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett. It's the latest book read by both our book clubs and tells the story of two black identical twins, Stella and Desiree, whose lives diverge dramatically when Stella leaves everything behind to pass as a white woman in 1950s America.
It's an absorbing exploration of identity and love, spanning 40 years of shifting attitudes towards race, class and gender. But what did our book clubs make of it? Did it spark debate? Keep listening to find out.
Here we are in the shed together in person. It's very exciting.
It is exciting.
And we don't know how much longer we'll be able to do this, so it makes it even sweeter.
Yeah, it's very nice. I feel slightly nervous having you here in person. And we're discussing The Vanishing Half, which both our book clubs ended up choosing.
Yeah. My book club chose it after yours. We were having our book club on Zoom, as we do now. And we only ever have book club for 40 minutes max, because that's how long Zoom gives you. And we had like a little alert counting down the seconds before we would all get kicked off the call. And we're like, well, what should we read next? I was like, I really want to read The Vanishing Half. Kate's book club is reading it. Shall we do it? Everyone was like, yeah, great. Okay, bye. And that's how we ended up here.
I wish my book club could be that efficient. We couldn't decide at the end of the one we've just had. I found this app that allows you to vote. We had 4 options and I idly set up this thing where they could vote. And then it was so gripping all day, like seeing, because it wasn't just like a yes or no. They could vote by percentage of like approval. And so all day I was kind of like watching these sliders going in and out of these books.
Could they rank them?
Unexpectedly nail biting. Kind of, yeah. So instead of having just binary choices, you know, it was like, well, I kind of want to read this one sort of 60%, but this one, I'll read it, but I don't feel so enthusiastic. I'm going to go with 40%.
Interesting. And that's how you chose The Vanishing Half?
No, this is how we chose the one that we're just doing, which is Bonjour Tristesse.
Very nice.
Sagan. So that's going to be coming up in the dim and distant future. But yes, I think for me, this just felt like a book where I kept reading about it. I hadn't read a bad word about it, which is always encouraging. You know, no one wants to read bad books, you know.
Especially not in the summer.
Exactly. And it felt like it would be a good page-turning summer read. Yeah, we were all quite happy to read it.
Same with my book club. They had all heard of it. It's been on all the summer reading lists, or I should say it was, because we are now heading into autumn. And my book club was very delighted to kind of join in with the masses that are reading it around the world. I did a bit of research today and I was really happy to learn that The Vanishing Half is already one of the best-selling books of the year. According to the Wall Street Journal, it's sold more than 160,000 print copies since it came out in early June. And the fact that cheered me was nearly 3 times the sales of Delia Owens's Where the Crawdads Sing after its first 11 weeks on the market back in 2018. And as you know, as some of the listeners may know, I wasn't a big fan of Where the Crawdads Sing.
What can I say? I loved it.
That's a fun episode, guys. You'll find that in the backlist.
Tell us what this book is about.
Twins, inseparable as children, ultimately choose to live in 2 very different worlds, one black and one white. The Vignes sisters will always be identical, but after growing up together in a small southern black community and running away at age 16, it's not just the shape of their daily lives that is different as adults. It's everything, including their racial identities. Many years later, one sister lives with her black daughter in the same southern town she once tried to escape. Across the country, the other secretly passes for white, and her white husband knows nothing of her past. Still, although separated by so many miles and just as many lies, the fates of the twins remains intertwined. What will happen when their own daughter's storylines intersect? So I think one of the reasons this has been such a bestseller is it's a great premise. It's a really intriguing hook.
Yeah, you're immediately very curious to know about these 2 girls. And when you start reading, you're just plunged right in, aren't you? We get to hear about their relationship with each other, this little town, this very claustrophobic little town that they live in. It's quite cinematic, I thought. And it was no surprise when I saw that I think it's been picked up by HBO for a 7-part...
For an adaptation.
Yeah, TV series. And that makes perfect sense because it's very vivid and you get really drawn in really quickly, I think. I mean, it is a page-turner.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a page turner that's beautifully written. I found this quote from Bernadine Evaristo, who won the Booker Prize with Girl, Woman, Other. And she said, "The Vanishing Half is an utterly mesmerizing novel. It seduces with its literary flair, surprises with its breathtaking plot twists, delights with its psychological insights, and challenges us to consider the corrupting consequences of racism on different communities and individual lives." I absolutely loved this book.
Well, Bernadine Evaristo may have loved it, but what did your book club think?
Well, yes. So we did love it. We were fairly universal in our praise. I might even say adoration. Phil said she's an amazing writer. Françoise said it was one of those books that you could just settle in. You just felt like you were in a really safe pair of hands. I read this book on my short summer holiday down on the English seaside, and it was actually a joyous experience. That sounds a bit OTT, but I had the time away from my daughter because my husband was there, but also my sister and her small children. So I just had a bit of space and nothing else to think about. And to be able to turn to this book with its page-turning plot, but also the caliber of the writing, it made me so happy. What about your book club?
Yeah, kind of same. I think everyone found it a pleasure to read. It's an easy read in that the book just draws you along and you can just relax and sink into it. And I think it's always such a pleasure. As you say, totally safe pair of hands. Really strong, vivid characters. You've got the twins, Stella and Desiree, and it's the way she plays with different points of view. Sometimes you're in Desiree's head, then you don't hear from Stella, and there's a sort of absence there that you share with Desiree and her mother after Stella leaves. And you sort of share in their devastation, this loss, this absence, but also the nuances of these decisions, you know, their frustration, like why has she turned away from them? Why has she turned away from her heritage? And then Desiree goes off to fend for herself and makes a life for herself, but is unlucky in the man that she falls in love with, and so is driven back home. So then we're in Mallard again, this small town where everyone is black but so light-skinned that there's almost a kind of a hierarchy then. There's a suggestion that the people of Mallard think themselves above other black people.
Very much.
Yeah.
Not a suggestion, very overt, because when Desiree returns, she brings with her her young daughter, Jude. And Jude is as black can be and experiences a huge amount of racism from her own community. And Desiree is ostracized to a certain extent because why on earth would she do this? The goal is to become lighter and lighter and lighter, even though very few individuals in the community ever leave it to really go and live the life of a white person in the way that Stella does.
And so the daughter, Jude, has a pretty miserable time in Mallard, but she is forced to adapt. And I think that that's one of the continual threads of this book, is about people's shifting identities, how people have to change and adapt themselves to the circumstances that they find themselves in. And then when we do find out about Stella's experiences, having passed over, having lied about her background and concealed it and become white, then how she's had to adapt, chameleon-like, to inhabit that position of entitlement and this unquestioning confidence in who she is. You know, that's what she's having to
perform.
Yeah, perform, really good word. Yeah, exactly. Or manufacture, you know. And then there's this suggestion that she'll be found out and it will all come crashing down, and how she's going to deal with that. I mean, it's so interesting as a character study, but I think for my book club, it's almost like it promised so much and it didn't quite deliver. I think people generally felt they would have liked more depth to these characters. And the plot is nicely complicated, pleasingly complicated. But I think there was a thought with my book club that the coincidences of that plot and the way that that plot hangs together, it was very cleverly done, but it almost felt slightly at the expense of developing those characters. But I don't know, because one person in my book club, Stuart, said that actually there was something about the economy of her style that was really pleasing, and I thought that too. Yeah. She doesn't overstate things. She doesn't overwrite. It's quite simply done.
Well, and also there's real potential in the plot for high drama, and she avoids that.
Yes.
There's only really one moment of drama where a wine glass drops, and then that section of the book ends and you transition. But still, you know, that's the moment of coincidence that a novel needs, perhaps, to intertwine these different characters. But from there, it's quite subtle. There's no huge dramatic moments in my mind, beyond that. And I think that makes it much more interesting. It's hard not to get into plot spoilers if you want to discuss Stella's story and Desiree's story as they mature into older women. We do know from the blurb that their daughters cross paths and have this strange friendship for many years, even before they know that they are family. The relationships between the mothers and daughters I thought were very acute, very touching, very painful, but in a way that was utterly convincing. Stella's relationship with her daughter Kennedy, who's just the ultimate flake. So I actually find it really surprising your book club found the characters a bit light. That might be true slightly of Desiree and Stella, but I thought the daughters, Jude and Kennedy, were utterly convincing.
Well, I think Kennedy was the one actually that a few people latched onto. So this is the white daughter of Stella, who I suppose it's because she's quite an unsympathetic. Well, it's not true to say she's unsympathetic. Your heart goes out to her because she's a child who's been brought up by a mother who is concealing something and cannot ever be open with her and honest. This is drawn quite carefully, this relationship, so that we understand that Kennedy was effectively shut out of her mother's life, even as she represented everything that her mother had hoped for and wanted. You know, it's that thing about when she finally got what she wanted, she finds that she's just floating up and down on a lilo in the swimming pool, feeling miserable. You know, it's that thing. What is it that we need to be happy? And I think this novel makes a powerful case for actually what we need is to be able to be emotionally honest with one another and the people who are close to us. And the tragedy of this racial barrier, which this novel then really highlights, is the way that that then interferes with that. There's a quote I read where she said that she didn't want to write a story about black pain. She wanted to write a story about black love. So the pain is in there, but you see the love. And I thought that balance was held really, really well. I thought that although there are, as you say, shocking things do happen, but they are treated almost quite neutrally in a way that doesn't become emotionally overwhelming. And yet you see the devastating impact that these events have on these characters that you come to care about.
For me, the real horror comes before the plot really kicks in. And that is, of course, when the twins, as 6-year-olds, see their father being lynched.
Yeah, that's the really shocking scene. And it haunts the rest of the book because this is an act of pure racially motivated hatred.
I feel like that horrific act is there to help us have empathy for any decision that these two young women make.
Yeah.
You know, it's utterly believable that Stella would choose to leave behind Mallard and her black identity because of that trauma as a child. You know, why wouldn't she want to abandon that if she could?
Why would Desiree not feel the same way?
Well, yeah, because they're different people.
Well, this is the thing. Natalie in my book club said she has a friend who's an identical twin. The book annoyed her as it gives a stereotypical view of twins as having opposite characters, which apparently most books that have twins in do, and isn't actually always the case when you have twins. I guess sometimes they might be quite similar in character.
Shall we read a passage about these twins?
Oh, yeah.
And this passage also brings in Mallard and their father. As the years passed, their father would only come to her in flashes, like when she fingered a denim shirt and felt small again, pressed against the rough fabric spanning her father's chest. You were supposed to be safe in Mallard, that strange, separate town, hidden amongst your own. But even here, where nobody married dark, you were still coloured, and that meant that white men could kill you for refusing to die. The Vignes twins were reminders of this, tiny girls in funeral dresses who grew up without a daddy because white men decided that it would be so. Then they grew older and just became girls, striking in both their sameness and differences. Soon it became laughable that there had ever been a time when no one could tell the twins apart. Desiree, always restless, as if her foot had been nailed to the ground and she couldn't stop yanking it. Stella, so calm that even Sal de la Fosse's ornery horse never bucked around her. Desiree starring in the school play once, nearly twice if the Fontenauds hadn't bribed the principal. Stella, whip smart, who would go to college if her mother could afford it. Desiree and Stella, Mallard's girls. As they grew, they no longer seemed like one body split in two, but two bodies poured into one, each pulling it her own way.
Yeah, it's full of lines like that, just really, really beautifully expressed. In a way that, you know, it's not showy, the writing. It doesn't seem fancy, but then quietly, it's just beautiful and just a pleasure to read. I think we all thought that.
We haven't talked about Reese and Jude.
Right. This idea of identity, you know, there's not only racial identity, she also weaves in gender identity with this character of Reese, who Jude meets at college. She goes on to UCLA on a running scholarship, and she meets this boy that she seems to have a real affinity with. They have a very easy relationship. And I think, although there's a sense that she does maybe have some friends in college in a way that she never did at school in Mallard, there's still a sense that she's quite an isolated individual. And so this connection with him is really important to her. And gradually we start to learn more about Rhys, and we learn that he, in fact, was born female. And he has
fled his hometown, and he's living in LA on the streets. But luckily he crosses paths with Barry, a gay man who's a drag queen, who takes him into his home, and Rhys becomes a part of this very warm, loving community. And then Jude comes into his life, and their love blossoms. Phil flagged that at first he thought it seemed a bit unnecessarily woke to have a transgender character woven into this story, but then actually it made her investigation of identity so much richer.
Yeah, it's almost felt really natural to have that character in there. For me, that really worked. He's sort of woven into the narrative in a way that feels like he belongs there.
Yeah, and it helped to pose questions, I think, around the choices we make about our identity and authenticity, perhaps, because Rhys is becoming who he's meant to be, but you never really feel that way about Stella, who is performing whiteness and is having to give up so much to do that, whereas Rhys is really more coming into his true self. I had this thing sometimes where I felt anxiety about Stella being found out, and that anxiety sort of came from thinking, oh, because she's doing something wrong. And then you have to question that, like, well, what's wrong about pretending to be white? Who cares? Why shouldn't she be able to make that choice? Should she choose it? And I just think Brit Bennett is so good and so subtle in making us think about these things. And I don't know, I don't feel that I have come to any conclusions from reading this book, but you can't help but question your own privilege. It's one of those books that makes you feel very open to considering things you never thought about before.
I didn't realise, since our book club met, I've read a New Yorker article by Sarah Resnick, and she talks about a literary tradition in the States on this theme of passing, which I just thought was quite interesting because it made me realise there's a whole level of meaning and nuance to this that actually would be completely lost on me. She says, The Vanishing Half tells the story of the Vignes sisters' diverging paths. In doing so, it belongs to a long tradition of literature about racial passing. From the antebellum period until the end of Jim Crow, countless black Americans crossed the colour line to pass as white, to escape slavery or threats of racial violence, or to gain access to the social, political and economic benefits conferred by whiteness. Narratives that dramatise this passage became a fixture of popular fiction, written by black and white, male and female authors alike. These stories repeat some version of a generic arc. The tragic mulatto, often a woman, chooses to leave home and pass for white. In time, anguished by the betrayal of her black identity, she returns to her family only to be met with a harsh fate, sometimes death. And then she goes on, by the late 20th century, the melodrama of these narratives, the predictable characters, the sad destinies had mostly been cast aside. But in The Vanishing Half, Bennett roots out these withered tropes and reanimates them in a fresh, surprising story. I just thought interesting, you know, I wouldn't have known any of that.
No.
It almost slightly explains to me why Stella has such an awful time. If it's playing with this idea of a character who passes and then has to be punished somehow.
Well, I mean, you say she's having an awful time. Only in the sense that she's kind of living with suburban ennui. I mean, she lives in a very elite Beverly Hills suburb with a beautiful pool, with her gorgeous husband, gorgeous daughter. And keep in mind, too, she does move beyond this housewife identity and pursue education and pursue a career later on.
Yes, but she's just so unhappy. I think that's so awful.
I think there is an understated happiness towards the end. Kennedy and her have come to an understanding. And the relationship has changed in a subtle, but I think very important way.
Maybe I'm also reading too much into it about daughters growing up and not having close relationships with their mothers. And I have 3 daughters and I'm like, oh my God.
I think you'll be okay.
Will they still have lunch with me? I don't know. Who can say?
Just linking back to that literary tradition, let me just read out this passage from earlier on in the book. This is from Desiree's point of view. In Mallard, you grew up hearing stories about folks who'd pretended to be white. Warren Fontenot riding a train in the white section, and when a suspicious porter questioned him, speaking enough French to convince him that he was a swarthy European. Marlena Goudeau becoming white to earn her teaching certificate. Luther Theobald, whose foreman marked him white and gave him more pay. Passing like this from moment to moment was funny, heroic even. Who didn't want to get over on white folks for a change? But the Pass Blanc were a mystery. You could never meet one who'd passed over undetected, the same way you'd never know someone who successfully faked her own death. The act could only be successful if no one ever discovered it was a ruse. Desiree only knew the failures, the ones who'd gotten homesick or caught or tired of pretending. But for all Desiree knew, Stella had lived white for half her life now, and maybe acting for that long ceased to be acting altogether. Maybe pretending to be white eventually made it so. And yet we know that Stella doesn't come to terms with her white identity, mainly because of her relationship with Loretta, who is the glamorous black wife of a very successful black actor in a beloved television comedy. And they have the audacity to move into this gated community in Beverly Hills, I think in 1968 or thereabouts, and are met with a huge amount of prejudice and racism. And Stella's very outspoken that they shouldn't be allowed in, and yet then develops a relationship with Loretta that somehow gives her solace, I think.
Well, because I think she sees in Loretta what she wants to be, which is someone who's comfortable in her own skin and comfortable with who she is. And
yeah, someone brave enough to be herself despite the racism that surrounds her.
Oh, that racism is so depressing, isn't it? It's just like, all of these characters from early. We haven't talked about early. I think what I did think was a shame was that the characters that are introduced, sometimes you just like to know a lot more about them, and it did feel like she kind of left early. So early met Desiree as a boy. His aunt and uncle who he lived with were passing through town. He was doing some sort of casual delivery work, and he met her at her house, and there was a kind of friendship between them. He was kind of in love, wasn't he? It sort of wasn't really stated, but and she was sort of attracted to him too, but she's still quite young, and as soon as the mother, Adele, finds out what's going on, she completely puts a stop to it and sends him away.
Because he's dark skinned?
Exactly, because of his dark skin. How could you even contemplate such a thing? And then he comes back later in the story. He's now a bounty hunter. So he hunts down people who are hiding. So again, this idea about identity and trying to pierce people's disguises. Early was such a great character, and I would have loved to have known more about Early, and you don't really hear that much about him.
He is also a very damaged person, and yet, to your point about Brit Bennett wanting to write about black love, he is able to not overcome, but to live a happy life with Desiree.
She ends up working at the diner, but she's trained as a fingerprint analyst and had been doing that in Washington for a number of years. And she goes to the neighbouring town to try and get a job with the police department there. And they take her application and she does the test and aces it, and the guy's busy marking. And then he glances at her address, and when he sees that she's from Mallard, he immediately is like, oh, don't waste my time, and sends her away. And that happens a lot. And it's just, you kind of know this is how things were, but it's still like just so gutting every time when these characters that you like and care about just get knocked back again and again and again. And in this case, not even because of the appearance of her skin, but because of the place that she came from.
And what that meant for her racial identity. Alice in my book club said, if only these characters had been born several generations later, everything would have been so much easier for them. Yeah. And yet, it's still painful, still fraught.
Yeah, and then this book was published just after the murder of George Floyd, and then the riots and protests that started, and then the movement that's been going on since then. So yeah, it felt culturally like it was a really important book to come along. And yeah, a light read. I know. A light thriller whodunit.
Yeah.
Maybe that's its genius, is that it does package up these issues that when you follow them to their conclusion have really serious implications.
And are exceptionally thought-provoking.
Yeah, in this quite breezy, very atmospheric, cinematic package. I think people in my book club were wondering whether it would stay with them particularly. It's been a while, listeners can probably tell, because we did this at the beginning of the summer. It's been a while since I've read it. And I remembered the twins very clearly. And actually, the relationship with the mother I really liked.
Their mother, Adele.
Their mother, Adele, yeah. And as time goes on, she becomes much older and she's suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. And actually that was quite tenderly done, I thought. This idea that, then she loses her memory, she loses her sense of who she is. They then have to be there to remind her. It was just quite beautifully woven in.
My dad read this book before me, and I don't know if I've told you, I certainly haven't told listeners, but at the beginning of lockdown, my dad started a reviewing system, a ranking system of like 1 to 5, and
love a system,
and he was going to apply it to all the books he'd read. and he had me look at the criteria and I helped him develop it.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yes. And then I popped it into a Google document so that I could join in and review books along with him. Just really short little snippets, but give them a score, which has been very satisfying. So he read it before me, and out of 5, he gave it a 4.2. He said, "This book is not what I expected. I thought the plot would be predictable. It's not. Entertaining and enlightening. This is a book to think about and enjoy. A great book club book because there are numerous parts on which I would like to exchange views. Highly recommend."
Yeah.
I think he's nailed it. Entertaining and enlightening.
Yeah. And it is one that you'd recommend. Definitely. It's a really good read. There's some real substance to it.
Yeah, I wrote, moving and memorable with flawed, even unlikable characters with whom you empathize and understand entirely. Brit Bennett writes beautifully, and I definitely read more of her books.
I'm quite looking forward to that HBO series.
Yeah. Are you going to read The Mothers?
Well, I would, except that, it's booker season and I've got the oppressive weight of 6 shortlisted books to get
Fair
through.
enough. Yeah, I'm feeling that weight too.
But I would very happily read something else by her, yeah. And also, she's a fairly young writer, isn't she? And I just think it's really exciting to see what she'll go on to write next.
So, to sum up, a great book and a great book club book, I think.
Yeah, really good discussion. Lots of interesting substance to it to discuss, but also an easy read for everyone. So everyone... I feel like, in a way, that's sort of the holy grail. You want a pleasurable read, not something you really have to kind of grit your teeth and get through. You want something that's a lovely read, but at the same time has got some real substance to it that makes for good discussion. And this absolutely had all of that. It was a perfect book club book. Inspired by The Vanishing Half, here are some more recommendations for your next book club read. Laura.
I am going to recommend A Drop of Patience by William Melvin Kelley.
That book again.
It's such a good book. I talked about it on a bookshelf episode a few months back now. It was written in 1965 by William Melvin Kelley, who is this forgotten heavyweight of American literature. He's just phenomenal. And my book club discovered him when we read A Different Drummer, which was the subject of a New Yorker article that brought it back into popular consciousness, just saying, why was this book forgotten? Now, that book is quite incredible, and I've explained it before, but just really quickly, the premise of that book is that the entire black population of an unnamed southern state one day just ups and leaves. And the novel is told from the perspective of the white people who are left behind. Now, it's fantastic. We did a book club episode on that. A Drop of Patience has since been released by a UK publisher, following on from that book success. In a way, I think it's even better. It's the story of Ludlow Washington, who we first meet as a 5-year-old, and Ludlow is blind and his family can't provide for him. And this reminds me too of Early, because Early's family really couldn't look after him anymore.
He was just given away, wasn't he?
He was given away to his aunt and uncle. Well, Ludlow Washington is left at this really harsh state institution for blind children, black blind children, where they're just treated horribly and the children are awful to each other. And this sounds quite bleak already, but what's so remarkable at William Melvin Kelley is that he can gesture towards these horrific experiences just in a line or two before then flipping forward to Ludlow as a young teenager. And he's an incredible musician. And he is basically sold as a teenager to a black jazz band who can keep him, who can make him work as a musician until he reaches the age of 18. And the story jumps forward throughout the moments in his life up until his early 30s as he differentiates himself as one of the geniuses of the jazz age. It's an incredible book. It's beautiful. There's so much going on in its examination of race in that Ludlow Washington is blind. He can't see the color of his skin. So he understands race as a construct, but in a very different way to everyone else. Also fascinating about this book is that we are told about events and experiences from his perspective. And so there's an emphasis on scent and sound rather than visuals. It would be such a good book club book. I've recommended it to many, many people now. They've all loved it. They're all baffled by the fact that it has fallen out of, the literary tradition. So yes, get your book club to read it.
It sounds brilliant, and you do keep bringing it up, and I really must read it, mustn't I?
It's also easy.
It's not even that I'm putting it off. It's just yeah.
You know what? You'd read it in a day.
I'm a bit overwhelmed by, this whole thing about the deluge of books coming out in October.
Yeah.
And I'm still catching up on all the books that I couldn't read in lockdown.
It's quite short. and you would probably read it in about a day, and you would feel so good after reading it. It has that strange feel-good factor of The Vanishing Half, in that you finish it and you feel that you've gone through almost a transformative experience. You've just read something of such caliber that it will stick with you.
Now, this is really selling it to me. Great. Well, I'd also want to recommend something that I think everyone should read, although I expect a lot of people have already. I was a bit late to the party. It's Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo, which, of course, very controversially, in partnership with Margaret Atwood, won the Booker Prize last year. I don't know why I put it off so long. It was almost just that thing about, the Booker winner, that slight sense of having to read something worthy, you know.
Yeah, I know.
And that was so stupid of me, because as soon as I started, within about 8 pages, I was just like, oh, this is such fun and it's great. It's so good. It's a little bit hard to sum up. The publishers have put From Newcastle to Cornwall, from the birth of the 20th century to the teens of the 21st, Girl, Woman, Other follows a cast of 12 characters on their personal journeys through this country and the last 100 years. They're each looking for something: a shared past, an unexpected future, a place to call home, somewhere to fit in, a lover, a missed mother, a lost father, even just a touch of hope. I was wary because I thought it was going to be like short stories, but in fact, the way that these characters are drawn and the connections between them is also beautifully done, that it didn't feel at all like short stories. It felt like I was reading something really kind of whole and consistent. And at the same time, you get so drawn into the individual characters. It's almost like when you leave one, there's a sort of moment where you're a bit reluctant to dive into another one. But within a page or two of reading the new one, you feel the same. She's brilliant. She's so good at these characters that just leap off the page. And there's a lot of stuff in here. Feminism, racial identity, gender, different generational perspectives and how they can clash. And there are some themes, yes, it was almost a little bit of a spoiler to talk about it, but there are some themes that connect quite directly with the themes of The Vanishing Half. But mainly, I just think it's such a wonderful read. I loved it, and I think everyone should read it. You don't need me to recommend it.
And a celebration of the Black British experience.
Very much
and
so.
Identity.
And I love the way, I think the thing I loved about it, it's a little bit didactic. You learn from it and you're told things, but in a way that I really appreciated.
Yeah.
It's just great. Some good straight talking in there. And it just feels really nice that you're not being talked down to, you're being included. You share this information in a way that I really liked. It's great. Really, really good.
Good for book club?
I think it would be great for book club, yeah. Effortlessly enjoyable read, and there's a lot to dig into. But I mean, you might, is it a mite too long? I felt afterwards I could possibly have done with like a couple less characters, because the sort of polyphony builds up and it was slightly hard to track. Like, so, there's stuff, of course, like you can, if you really want
flawed.
to. Yeah. But mainly as a reading experience, though, it is a delight.
Well, you talked briefly about the tradition of passing in American literature, and Frances, in my book club, has read Nella Larsen's book Passing, which came out in 1929. I thought it would be brilliant if she could tell us a little bit more about that and whether it would make for a good book club book.
Nella Larsen was an author in the 1920s. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance. And this book is about two women who are both black, but Claire is passing as white with the aim of improving her life's lot. And she is married to a white man who has no idea of her background and who is extremely racist. So there's trouble brewing. But really, most of the book is focused on the complex relationship between these two women and the kind of lives they want to lead. There's a hint of sexual tension. It's really interesting because it's first-hand 1920s, and you get the idea of these choices that people perhaps were making and taking, and it ends in a very different way to The Vanishing Half, but they're interesting companion pieces. There's definitely enough for a book club to get their teeth into. There are moments in the book, I think, that nod to Passing, and it would be wonderful to unpick the two together.
That's all for this episode.
Our book recommendations were A Drop of Patience by William Melvin Kelley, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernadine Evaristo, and Passing by Nella Larsen.
On our next book club show, we'll be discussing The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, the latest book read by my book club. First published in 1994 in Japanese, this modern classic is narrated by R, a young novelist living on a totalitarian island where the authorities wipe memories. To quote from the book's blurb, hat, ribbon, bird, rose, to the people on the island, a disappeared thing no longer has any meaning. When a young novelist discovers that her editor is in danger of being taken away by the memory police, she desperately wants to save him. For some reason, he doesn't forget, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for him to hide his memories. Who knows what will vanish next? The Memory Police was only translated into English by Stephen Snyder this year, and it went on to be shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. It didn't win, but nonetheless has been heaped with praise. The Guardian writes it's a masterpiece, a deep pool that can be experienced as fable or allegory, warning and illumination. I'm so looking forward to reading this one, and listeners, you could even join in. You've got a few weeks yet before that episode will be out.
In the meantime, don't miss our interview with Emily Rhodes, who runs the Walking Book Club of London's Hampstead Heath. She tells us about the joys of walking and talking about books, and that episode is out now.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or you can always email us at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? If you like what we do, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It helps other listeners find us and means you'll never miss an episode.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.